The Green Grove, Chapter 25 of Shardik by Richard Adams. The nearest tavern in the colonnade, whose sign proclaimed it to be the Green Grove, was out of the wind, but warmed, nevertheless, at this early time of the year, by a charcoal brazier, low enough to keep floor draughts from chilling the feet. The tables were still damp from their morning's scrubbing, and the settle, facing towards the square, was spread with brightly coloured rugs, which, though somewhat worn, were clean and well brushed. The place appeared to be frequented chiefly by the better kind of men having work or business in the market, buyers, household stewards, caravan officers, merchants, and one or two market officials, with their uniform green cloaks and round leather hats. There were pumpkins and dried tendrionas hanging in nets against the walls, and pickled aubergines, cheeses, nuts, and raisins set out in dishes. Through a door at the back could be caught a glimpse of a courtyard with white doves and a fountain. Elleroth and Mallow sat down at one end of the settle and waited without impatience. "Well, Death, don't come along just yet," cried a long-haired young caravaneer, flinging back his cloak to free his arm as he drank, and looking over the top of his leather can as though half expecting that unwelcome personage to make a sudden appearance round the corner. "I've got a bit more profit to make down south and a few more jars to empty here, haven't I, Terrace?" he added, to a pretty girl with a long black plait and a necklace of silver coins, who set down before him a plate of hard-boiled eggs and sour cream. "Aye, likely," she answered, "without you get yourself killed in south one trip. Profit, profit. Happen you'd go to Surrey for profit." "Aye, happen," he mimicked, teasing her, and spreading out a row of foreign coins, one under each finger, for her to take whatever was due in payment. "Help yourself. Why don't you take me now instead of the money?" "I'm not that hard up yet," retorted the girl, taking 3 of the coins and coming across to the settle. Her eyelids were stained with indigo, and she had pinned a bunch of red-flowering tectron in her bodice. She smiled at Mallow and Elleroth, a little unsure how to address them, since on the one hand they were strangers, and clearly gentlemen, while on the other they had been an audience for her little flirtation with the caravaneer. "Good morning, my dear lass," said Elleroth, speaking as though he were her grandfather, and at the same time looking her up and down with an air of open admiration, which left her more confused than ever. "I wonder whether you have any real wine from the south, Yeldeshay, perhaps, or even just Lepan. What we need to drink on a morning like this is sunshine." "There's none come in for a long while, sir, more's the pity," answered the girl. "'Tis the war, you see. We can't get it." "Now, I'm sure you're underrating the resources of this splendid establishment," replied Elleroth, putting 2 20-milled pieces quietly into her hand. "And you can always pour it into a jug so that no one else knows what it is. Ask your father. Just bring the best you've got, so long as it's, pre-bear, you know, pre-bear. We shall recognize it all right if it's from the south." 2 men came through the chain-curtained entrance and called to the girl in Chistel, smiling across at her. "I suppose you have to learn a lot of languages with so many admirers?" asked Mallow. "Nay, they've to learn mine or I'm doon with them," she smiled, nodding as she left to Elleroth to show that she would do as he had asked. "Ah, well, I suppose the world still takes a lot of stopping," said Elleroth, leaning back on the settle, snapping a pickled aubergine and throwing half into his mouth. "What a pity so many furious boys persist in trying. Will it suit you if we go on talking Yeldeshay, by the way? I'm tired of speaking Becklin, and Dealgai is beyond me, I fear. One advantage of this place is that no one would think it unduly odd, I believe, if we were to converse by coughing down each other's necks or tapping the table with very large toothpicks. A little Yeldeshay will be all in the day's work to them." "That boy," said Mallow. "You gave him money after he'd stolen my knife. And what was that hole in his ear? You seemed to know what you were looking for, all right." "You have no inkling, Provincial Governor?" "None." "Long may you continue to have none. You met this man Lallock, you told me, in Dealgai. I wonder, did you ever hear tell of one Genshed?" "No." "Well, curse the war, then!" shouted a man who had just come in, evidently in reply to some remark of the landlord, standing before him with compressed lips, shrugged shoulders, and hands held out on either side. "Bring us anything, only be quick. I'm off south again in half an hour." What's the news of the war? Called Elleroth across the room. Ah, it's going to get rough again now the spring's here, sir, answered the man. There will be nothing coming up from the south now. No, not for some months, I dare say. General Urquetlis is on the move, likely to drive up east of Lipan, so I've heard. Elleroth nodded. The girl returned with a plain earthenware jug, leather beakers, and a plate of fresh radishes and watercress. Elleroth filled both cans, drank deeply, and then looked up at her open-mouthed, with an exaggerated expression of astonishment and delight. The girl giggled and went away. "Better than we might have expected," said Elleroth. "Well, never mind about the poor boy, Mollo. Put it down to eccentricity on my part. I'll tell you one day. Anyway, it's got nothing to do with what we were talking about on the lake." "How did they get the bear back?" asked Mollo, crunching a radish and spreading out his legs towards the brazier. "What I heard, if it's true, it frightens me, and no one's ever told me it's not, was that the bear smashed through the Becklin line and killed Geleflin as if he knew who he was. That's one thing they can all tell you in Dealguy, because there was a Dealguy contingent in the Becklin army, and the bear killed their commander at the same time, tore his throat out. You must admit it's all very strange." "Well, then the bear disappeared as night was falling, but you know where it is now, there, up the hill." He jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "This man, Krendrick, the king, he spent the whole of the following summer tracking it down," replied Elleroth. "As soon as the rains ended, he went out with his priestesses, or whatever they call them, and worked over the whole country, from Cabin to Terkenalt, and from Gelt to the Tertherna. He used to be a hunter, I believe. Well, whether he was or not, he found the bear at last, in some very inaccessible part of the hills, and he fired the whole hillside, including 2 wretched villages, to force it down to the plain. Then he made it insensible with some kind of drug, hobbled it with chains—" "Hobbled it?" interrupted Mollo. "How on earth do you hobble a bear?" "They'd learned that no cage would hold it, so I was told. So while it was drugged, they fastened its legs to a choke chain round its neck, so that the more it kicked, the more it throttled itself. Then it was dragged to Bekla on an open-wheeled platform in less than 2 days, something like 60 miles. They had relays of men to take over from one another, and never stopped at all. Even so, it nearly died. Didn't terribly care for the chains, you see. But it only goes to show, my dear Mollo, how much importance the Ortelgans attach to the bear, and to what lengths they're prepared to go in anything that concerns it. Teltherna diving boys they may be, but they're evidently inspired to great heights by that animal." "They call it the power of God," said Mollo. "Are you sure it isn't?" "My dear Mollo, what can you mean? Let me fill up that leather thing you have there. I wonder whether they have any more of this." "Well, I can't account for all that's happened in any other way. Old Smar feels the same. He said they were meant to win. First the Becklins fail to get any sort of news of what's happened, and then they go and split their army in 2, and then the rains break, and then the bear kills Geleflin just when he's got them beaten, and no one in Bekla has the least warning until the Ortelgans are down upon them. Are you really saying that's all mere coincidence?" "Yes, I am," replied Elleroth, dropping his whimsical manner, and leaning over to look straight into Mollo's face. "An over-civilized people grow complacent and careless, and leave the door open for a tribe of fanatical savages, through a mixture of luck, treachery, and the foulest inhumanity, to usurp their place for a few years." "A few years? It's 5 years already." 5 years are a few years. Are they secure? You know they're not. They're opposed by a brilliant general, with a base as near as Ikat. The Becklin Empire is reduced to half of what it was. The southern provinces have seceded. Yelda, Belishba, arguably Lipan. Poltesh would like to secede and daren't. Dealguy and Terkenalt are both enemies as far as they can spare time from their own troubles. The Ortelgans could be overthrown this summer. That Krendrick, he'll end in Zeray, you mark my words. They're reasonably prosperous. There's plenty of trade still in Bekla. Trade? Yes, what sort of trade, I wonder? And you've only to look round you to see how badly even a place like this is affected. What used to bring more prosperity to Bekla than anything else? Building, masonry, carving, all that sort of craftsmanship. That trade is ruined. There's no labor. The big craftsmen have quietly gone elsewhere, and these barbarians know nothing of such work. As for the outer provinces and the neighboring kingdoms, it's only a very occasional patron who sends to Bekla now. Plenty of trade. What sort of trade, Mollo? Well, the iron comes in from Gelt, and the cattle. What sort of trade, Mollo? The slave trade, if that's what you're getting at. Well, but there's slave trading everywhere. People who lose wars get taken prisoner. You and I fought together once to keep it at that. These men are desperate for trade to pay for their war and feed the subject people they're holding down. Desperate for any sort of trade. So it's no longer kept at that. What sort of trade, Mollo? The children, is that what you're getting at? Well, if you want my opinion... Excuse me, gentlemen. I don't know if you're interested, but I'm told the king is approaching. He'll be crossing the market in a few moments. I thought, as you gentlemen seem to be visitors to the city. The landlord was standing beside them, smiling obsequiously and pointing out through the entrance. Thank you, replied Elroth. That's very good of you. Perhaps, he slid another gold piece into the landlord's hand, if you could contrive to find some more of this excellent stuff. Charming girl, your daughter. Oh, your niece? Delightful. We'll return in a few minutes. They went out into the colonnade. The square had become hotter and more crowded, and the market servants, carrying pitchers and long aspergills of bound twigs, were walking hither and thither, laying the glittering sandy dust. At a distance, above, the north front of the baron's palace stood in shadow, the sun, behind it, glinting here and there upon the marble balustrades of the towers and the trees on the terraces below. As Mollo stood gazing in renewed wonder, the gongs of the city clocks sounded the hour. A few moments afterwards he heard, approaching by the street down which he and Elroth had come that morning, the ringing of another gong, softer and of a deeper, more vibrant pitch. People were drawing aside. Some were leaving the square altogether or slipping into various doorways round the colonnade. Others, however, waited expectantly as the gong drew nearer. Mollo edged his way between those nearest to him and craned his neck, peering over the beam of the great scales. 2 files of soldiers were coming down the hill, pacing slowly on either side of the street. Although they were armed in the Becklin style, with helmet, shield, and short sword, their dark eyes, black hair, and rough, unkempt appearance showed them to be Ortelgans. Their swords were drawn, and they were looking vigilantly about them among the crowd. The man bearing the gong, who walked at the head of and between the 2 files, was dressed in a grey cloak edged with gold, and a blue robe embroidered in red with the mask of the bear. The heavy gong hung at the full extent of his left arm, while his right hand, holding the stick, struck the soft, regular blows which both announced the king's approach and gave their step to the soldiers. Yet the beat was not that of marching men, but rather of solemn procession, or of a sentinel pacing on some terrace or battlement alone. Behind the man with the gong came 6 priestesses of the bear, scarlet-cloaked and adorned with heavy barbaric jewelry, necklaces of ziltate and panapa, belts of inlaid bronze, and clusters of carved wooden rings so thick that the fingers of their folded hands were pressed apart. Their grave faces were those of peasant girls, ignorant of gentle ways, and accustomed to a narrow life of daily toil, yet they carried themselves with a dark dignity, withdrawn and indifferent to the staring crowd on either side. At their centre walked the solitary figure of the priest-king. It had not occurred to Mollo that the king would not be carried, either in a litter or on a chair, or drawn in a cart, perhaps, by caparisoned and gilt-horned oxen. He was taken unawares by this curious lack of state, by this king who walked through the dust of the marketplace, who stepped aside to avoid a coil of rope lying in his path, and a moment after tossed his head, dazzled by a flash of light reflected from a pail of water. In his curiosity, he climbed precariously on the plinth of the nearest column and gazed over the heads of the passing soldiers. The train of the king's long cloak of blue and green was raised and held behind him by 2 of the priestesses. Each blue panel bore in gold the mask of the bear, and each green panel the emblem of the sun as a lidded and radiant eye, the eye of God. His long staff of polished zoan wood was bound about with golden filigree, and from the fingers of his gauntlets hung curving silver claws. His bearing, that neither of a ruler nor a warrior, possessed nevertheless a mysterious and cryptic authority, stark and ascetic, the power of the desert dweller and the anchorite. The dark face, haggard and withdrawn, was that of a man who works in solitude, the face of a hunter, a poet, or a contemplative. He was young, yet older than his years, going grey before his time, with a stiffness in the movement of one arm which suggested an old injury ill-healed. His eyes seemed fixed on some inward scene which brought him little peace, so that even as he looked about him, raising his hand from time to time in sombre greeting to the crowd, he appeared preoccupied and almost disturbed, as though his thoughts were struggling in disquiet with some lonely anxiety beyond the common preoccupations of his subjects, beyond riches and poverty, sickness and health, appetite, desire, and satisfaction. Walking like other men through the dusty marketplace in the light of morning, he was separated from them by more than the flanking soldiers and the silent girls, by arcane vocation to an ineffable task. As Mallow watched, there came into his mind the words of an old song. What cried the stone to the chisel? Strike, for I am afraid. What said the earth to the ploughman? Ah, the bright blade! The last soldiers were receding at the far end of the square, and as the sound of the gong died away, the business of the market resumed. Mallow joined Elleroth, and together they returned to the green grove and their place on the settle. It was now less than an hour to noon, and the tavern had become more crowded, but, as is often the way, this added to their seclusion rather than otherwise. "Well, what do you think of the kingly boy?" inquired Elleroth. "Not what I expected," answered Mallow. "He didn't strike me as the ruler of a country at war, that's the size of it." "My dear fellow, that's merely because you don't understand the dynamic ideas prevalent down on the river where the reeds all shiver. Matters there are determined by resort to hocus-pocus, mumbo-jumbo, and even, for all I know, jiggery-pokery, the shades of distinction being fine, you understand. Some barbarians slit animals open and observe portents revealed in the steaming entrails, yum-yum. Others scan the sky for birds or storms. Ebon clouds, oh dear. These are what one might term the blood-and-thunder methods. The Teltherna boys, on the other hand, employ a bear. It's all the same in the end. It saves these people from having to think, which they're not terribly good at, really. Bears, dear creatures, and many bears are among my best friends, have to be interpreted no less than entrails and birds, and some magical person has to be found to do it. This man, Krendrick, you are right. He could neither command an army in the field nor administer justice. He is a peasant, or at all events he is not of noble birth. He is the wonderful who stepped out of the rainbow. A familiar figure, dear me, yes. His monarchy is a magical one. He has taken it upon himself to mediate to the people the power of the bear, the power of God, as they believe." "What does he do, then?" "Ah, good question. I am glad you asked it. What, indeed? Everything but think, we may be sure. I have no idea what methods he employs. Possibly the bear piddles on the floor, and he observes portents in the steaming whatnot. How would I know? But a crystal ball of some kind there must surely be. One thing I know about the man, and this is genuine enough for what it's worth, he possesses a certain curious ability to go near the bear without being attacked. Apparently he has been known even to touch it and lie down beside it. As long as he can go on doing that, his people will believe in his power, and therefore in their own. And that, no doubt, accounts, my dear Mallow, for his having the general air of one finding himself in a leaking canoe with a vivid realization that he cannot swim." "How so?" "Well, one day, sooner or later, the bear is fairly sure to wake up in a bad temper, yes? Growl, growl, biff, biff, oh dear, applications are invited for the interesting post. That, in one form or another, is the inevitable end of the road for a priest-king. And why not? He doesn't have to work, he doesn't have to fight. Well, obviously he has to pay for it somehow." "If he's the king, why does he walk through the streets on his own 2 feet?" "I confess I'm not sure, but I conceive that it may be something to do with his being different in one respect from others of his kind. As a rule, among these roughs, the priest is himself the manifestation of God. They kill him now and then, just to keep in mind of it. Now here, the bear is the divine creature, and the gentleman we have just been admiring represents, as long as he can keep on going near it, a proof that the bear means him, and therefore his people, good and not harm. The bear's savagery is working on their side and against their enemies. They have cornered it until it, as it were, corners him. It may well be the whole point that he is plainly vulnerable and yet remains unharmed, a magic trick. So he takes pains to show that he is indeed a real and ordinary human being by walking through the city every day. Mallow drank and pondered in silence. At last he said, "You're like a lot of men from Ikat. I come from Lapan. From Lapan, jolly man. From Sarkid, actually, but not from Ikat. Well, you're like a lot of the Selners. You think everything out, trust in your minds, and nothing else. But people up here aren't like that. The Ortelgans have established their power in Bekla." "They have not." "They have, and principally for one reason. It's not just that they've fought well, and it's not just that there's already been a great deal of intermarriage with Beklan girls. Those are just things that follow from the real reason, which is Shardik. How is it that they've succeeded against all probability unless Shardik is really the power of God? Look what he did for them. Look what they've achieved in his name. Everyone who knows what happened. It's lost nothing in the telling. Everyone feels now what Smar felt from the outset. They're meant to win. We don't reason it all out like you. We see what's before our eyes, and what's before our eyes is Shardik. That's it." Elroth leant forward with his elbows on the table and bent his head, speaking earnestly and low. "Then let me tell you something, Mallow, that you evidently don't know. Are you aware that the whole worship of Shardik, as carried out here in Bekla, is knowingly contrary to the Ortelgan's traditional and orthodox cult, of which this man they call Krendrick is not and never has been the legitimate head?" Mallow stared. "What? You don't believe me, do you? I'm not going to quarrel with you, Elroth, after all we've been through together, but I hold authority under these people. They've made my fortune, if you like, that's it. And you want me to believe that they're... Listen." Elroth glanced round quickly and then continued. "This is not the first time that these people have ruled in Bekla. Long ago they did so, and in those days, too, they worshipped a bear, but it was not kept here. It was kept on an island in the Teltherna, Kiso. The cult was controlled by women. There was no priest-king, no eye of God. But when at last they lost Bekla and fell from power, their enemies were careful to see that no bear remained to them. The chief priestess and the other women were allowed to stay on their island, but without a bear." "Well, the bears returned at last. Isn't that a sure sign?" "Ah, but wait, good honest Mallow. All is not told. When the bear returned, as you put it, when they acquired this new model, there was a chief priestess on the island, a woman with a reputation of being no fool. She knows more about disease and healing than any doctor south of the Teltherna, or north of it either, I should think. There's no doubt that she's effected a great many remarkable cures." "I think I've heard something about her now you mention it, but not in connection with Shardik." "At the time when this bear first appeared, 5 or 6 years ago, she was the recognized and undisputed head of the cult, her office having descended regularly for God only knows how long. And this woman would have nothing to do with the attack on Bekla. She has consistently maintained that the attack was not the will of God, but an abuse of the cult of the bear, and consequently she has been kept in virtual imprisonment, with a few of her priestesses, on that Teltherna island, even though the bear, her bear, is being kept in Bekla." "Why hasn't she been murdered?" "Ah, dear Mallow, the penetrating realist, always straight to the point. Why, indeed, has she not been murdered? I don't know, but I dare say they fear her as a sorceress. What she has undoubtedly retained is her reputation as a healer. That was why my brother-in-law travelled 150 miles to consult her at the end of last summer." "Your brother-in-law? Emertiltha is married, then?" "Emertiltha is married. Ah, Mallow, do I see a slight shadow cross your face, stemming, as it were, from old memories? She has the kindest memories of you, too, and hasn't forgotten nursing you after that wound which you were so reckless as to get through saving me. Well, Sildane is a very shrewd, sensible fellow. I respect him. About a year ago he got a poisoned arm. It wouldn't heal, and no one in Lapan could do it any good, so at last he took it into his head to go and see this woman. He had a job to get on the island. She's kept pretty well incommunicado, it seems. But in the end they let him, partly because he bribed them, and partly because they saw he'd probably die if they didn't. He was in a bad way at the time. She cured him all right, quite simply apparently, by applying some sort of mold. That's the trouble about doctors. They always make you do something revolting, like drinking bat's blood. Have some more wine?" But while he was there, he learned a little, not much, about the extent to which the Ortelgans have abused the cult of the bear. I say not much, because apparently they're afraid that the priestess's very existence may stir up trouble against them, and she's watched and spied on all the time. But Sildane told me more or less what I've told you, that she's a wise, honorable, and courageous woman, and that she's the rightful head of the cult of the bear, and that according to her interpretation of the mysteries, there was no sign that they were divinely intended to attack Bekla, and that this man, Krendrick, and that other fellow, Pinion, whatever he called himself, appropriated the bear by force for their own purposes, and that everything that's been done since then has been nothing but blasphemy, if that is the right term. I wonder still more why they haven't murdered her. Apparently it's rather the other way round. They feel the lack of her, and they haven't yet given up hope of persuading her to come to Bekla. In spite of all he's done, the Krendrick man still feels great respect for her, but although he sent several times to beg her to come, she always refuses. Unlike you, Mallow, she won't be a party to their robbery and bloodshed. It still doesn't alter their extraordinary success and the confidence with which they fight. I've got every reason to support them. They've made me governor of Cabin, and if they go, I go. Well, they've left me as Ban of Sarkid, if it comes to that. Nevertheless, the number of hoots I give for them is restricted to less than 2. Do you think I'd sell the honor of Sarkid for a few meld from these dirty, murderous... Mallow laid a hand on his arm, and glanced quickly sideways without moving his head. The landlord was standing just behind the settle, apparently absorbed in trimming the wick of a lamp fixed to the wall. "Can we have some bread and cheese?" said Elroth and Yildashay. The landlord gave no sign that he understood. "We have to go now, landlord," said Elroth and Becklin. "Do we owe you anything further?" "Nothing at all, good sirs, nothing at all," said the landlord, beaming and presenting each of them with a small model in iron of the great scales. "Allow me a little souvenir of your visit to the Green Grove. A neighbor makes them. We keep them for our special customers. Greatly honored. Hope we shall have the pleasure on another occasion. My poor house, always glad." "Tell Terrace to buy herself something pretty," said Elroth, putting 10 meld on the table. "Ah, sir, too kind, most generous. She'll be delighted. A charming girl, isn't she? No doubt, if you wished. Good morning," said Elroth. They stepped out into the colonnade. "Do you think he may perhaps make a point of hiding his linguistic abilities from the common light of day?" he asked, as they strolled once more across the market. "I'd like to know," answered Mallow. "I can't help wondering why he trims lamps at noon, or why he trims lamps at all, if it comes to that, seeing it's women's work and he has that girl to help him." Elroth was turning the ugly little model over in his hands. I feared it. He must take us for utter fools. Does he think we can't recognize the Gelt iron mark when we see it? So much for his neighbor who makes them, weighed in the great scales and found non-existent. He placed the model on a windowsill overlooking the street, and then, as an afterthought, bought some grapes from a nearby stall. Having put a grape carefully into each scale, he handed half the remainder to Mallow, and they walked on, eating grapes and spitting out the pips. "But does it really matter whether the fellow understood you or not?" asked Mallow. "I know I warned you when I saw him standing there, but it's become second nature after all these years. I can't hardly believe you could be accused on his evidence, let alone convicted of anything serious. It'd be his word against mine, anyway, and of course I can't remember hearing you say anything whatever against the Ortelgans." "No, I'm not afraid of being arrested for that sort of thing," answered Elroth, "but all the same, I've got my reasons for not wanting these people to know my true feelings." "Then you'd better be more careful." "Indeed, yes. But I'm rash, you know. Such an impetuous boy." "I know that," replied Mallow, grinning. "Haven't changed, have you?" "Hardly at all. Ah, now I recall where we are. This brook is the outfall of the Barb, which runs down to what was once the Tamarick Gate. If we follow it upstream along this rather pleasant path, it will bring us back close to the Peacock Gate, where that surly fellow let us out this morning. Later on, I want to stroll out beyond the Barb as far as the walls on the east side of Crandor." "What on earth for?" "I'll tell you later. Let's talk of old times for the moment. Amor Tilthe will be delighted to hear that you and I have met again. You know, if you ever had to leave Cabin, you'd always be welcome in Sarkid as long as you liked to stay." "Leave Cabin? I'm not likely to do that for at least a year or two, though you're very kind." You never know. It's all a question of what you can, bear, as it were. How straight the smoke is going up, and the swifts are high, too. Perhaps the weather is going to be kinder during our stay than I dared to hope.